preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Jewish Omnibus at the 92nd Street Y. Tonight we're offering you the second of a three-part series entitled, provocatively, Nearsighted Visions of Redemption, with a question mark. That is not a supposition, in which we are examining three of the major conceptual phenomena of this century, which, whether coincidentally or not, were generated by original minds, Jewish minds, of the 19th century. Last week we looked at Freud and psychoanalysis. This week we are looking at Marx and Marxism. And next week we'll be looking at Herzl and the birth of modern Zionism. And especially are looking at the question of what was the attraction that these mass movements, as they eventually became, had for the Jewish community. At one time or another, Jewish names surface in each of these movements, logically, of course, in connection with Zionism, but why the other two as well? And that's the phenomenon we're going to be examining, whether in fact the supposition is correct that Jews did have a significant part to play in these dreams of transformation of the world and society, and what special attraction such movements might have had for Jews, if indeed there was one. Tonight's program, we're pleased to bring you our speaker, Dr. Harvey Klehr, who is Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Politics at Emory University, where he has been teaching in the Political Science Department since 1971. He is a native of Newark, New Jersey, Aleha Shalom. I can say that because I spent not a few of my own growing up years in Newark, so it was nice to hear a familiar accent. And Professor Klehr has his bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College, his doctoral degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In addition to his numerous contributions to professional journals, his writings have enriched the pages of Commentary, The New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and the Wall Street Journal. He serves on a number of community and national boards, including the Atlanta Hillel Foundation, the National Executive Board of the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the League for Industrial Democracy and is a past president of Emory's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. Of special pertinence to us tonight is that he is also the author of two rather provocatively titled books. One, The Heyday of American Communism, the Depression Decade, and a work which was commissioned originally by the Anti-Defamation League B'nai B'rith, Far Left of Center, the American Radical Left Today. Following Dr. Klehr's presentation, we'll be seated here together, and after I have an opportunity to make some inquiries myself as the privilege as moderator, I'll be glad to open it up to you members of the audience to follow up on any points you would like to see explored in further detail. Won't you welcome Dr. Harvey Klehr?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by telling you a story, apocryphal to be sure, but very much to the point of my lecture tonight. Two of the top leaders of the Communist International, Karl Radek and Gregory Zinoviev, had come to Germany in 1918 to help ignite a communist revolution there. Radek and Zinoviev were Jews, as were a number of other leading Bolsheviks. So was Rosa Luxemburg, the most famous German radical, as well as Bela Kun, the leader of the new communist regime in Hungary. And of course, Karl Marx himself was descended from a long line of rabbis. Radek was addressing the crowd, and his revolutionary enthusiasm was beginning to carry him away. We have had the revolution in Russia, and the revolution in Hungary, and now the revolution is erupting in Germany. And after that, he enthused, we will have the revolution in France, and the revolution in England, and the revolution in America. As he stopped for breath, Zinoviev leaned over and whispered, Karl, there won't be enough Jews to go around. Few topics have been as sensitive as the seemingly disproportionate number of Jews attracted to revolutionary movements, particularly Marxist ones, in the last century. For many years, anti-Semites of all kinds have linked Jews with Bolshevism or communism. To enemies of the Jews as varied as Henry Ford and Ibn Saud, to call someone a Jewish communist was an exercise in redundancy. American Jews were never so concerned about this linkage as in the early 1950s, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for spying for the Soviet Union, Morton Sobel was given an extended prison sentence, and publicity about the Hollywood 10 and other alleged communists and spies included large numbers with obvious Jewish names. Anti-Semites rushed forward to charge that Jews were not loyal citizens or that they owed allegiance to a foreign power. There were accusations that Jews had cunningly corrupted American culture. On the floor of the House of Representatives, John Rankin of Mississippi informed his colleagues, quote, "Communism is older than Christianity. It hounded and persecuted the Savior during his earthly ministry, inspired his crucifixion, derided him in his dying agony, and then gambled for his garments at the foot of the cross," end quote. It is, of course, true that Marxist movements around the world, both socialist and communist, have had an unusually large representation of Jews in their ranks. Until Stalin's purges, a substantial percentage of the top leadership of the Bolsheviks was of Jewish origin. 161 of the top 200 officials of Bela Kun's brief-lived Hungarian communist government were Jews. Although Jews were only about 12% of the Polish population in the 1920s, the Polish Communist Party was 25% Jewish. When Soviet governments were installed in Eastern Europe after World War II, Jews were prominent in the leadership in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. In virtually every European country, ranging from Germany and Austria to France and Britain, communist parties had higher percentages of Jews in their ranks than their percentage of the population would have led one to predict. There's a seeming paradox in the fact that Jews were attracted to a movement founded and inspired by a man who was himself an anti-Semite. Not only was Karl Marx personally hostile to Jews and Jewish interests, but his doctrine itself was permeated with anti-Semitism. And regimes founded on its principles have been among the greatest enemies of Jews in this century. Although he was descended from a long line of rabbis, Marx was baptized by his father, a civil servant who converted in order to retain his government position. Karl never evinced any sympathy for his former co-religionists. Throughout his life, Marx was given to vicious slurs against individual Jews. Most notably, Ferdinand Lassalle, his great rival for the leadership of the German socialist movement. In private correspondence, Marx referred to Lassalle as, quote, "a Jewish nigger," end quote. He also denounced him as a Polish Jew and added, quote, "the Jews of Poland are the dirtiest of all races," end quote. Marx was also quick to credit negative information about Jews. He gleefully informed his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, that the Jewish exodus from Egypt had actually been the expulsion of a group of lepers, and, quote, "Lazarus the leper is therefore the archetype of the Jew," end quote. In an essay, a famous essay on the Jewish question, Marx did reject the argument that Jews did not deserve rights in capitalist society. But he did so in the course of arguing that Jews had infected that society so thoroughly with their values that only the overthrow of the entire society would free mankind. What, Marx asked, what is the worldly cult of the Jews? And he immediately answered, huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. If mankind, Marx believed, could only eliminate the economic life that Jews so vividly symbolized, it would, quote, make the Jew impossible, and Jewish religious consciousness, again a quote, would evaporate like some insipid vapor. In the final analysis, Marx concluded, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. In emancipating itself from hucksterism and money, and thus from real and practical Judaism, our age would emancipate itself, end quote. Although this was his most sustained and vicious attack on Judaism, a parroting of the crudest anti-Semitic canards of the age, Marx did not abandon these views in his more mature days. In Das Kapital, he wrote, quote, the capitalist knows that all commodities, however scurvy they may look, or however badly they may smell, are in faith and in truth money, inwardly circumcised Jews, end quote. Nor did many of Marx's followers misunderstand the lesson he taught. Rosa Luxemburg insisted that Marx had proven, quote, what is usually described and persecuted as Judaism is nothing but the spirit of hucksterism and swindle, which appears in every society where exploitation reigns, end quote. Is it any surprise that when asked to protest an atrocity against her own kith and kin, she responded, why do you come to me with your special Jewish sorrows? I cannot find a special corner in my heart for the ghetto, end quote. Likewise, when Vladimir Lenin wrote in 1903 that the idea of a Jewish nationality is definitely reactionary because he believed it promoted hostility to assimilation, he was merely echoing Marx's belief that the only material basis for Jewish existence was money-making. If capitalism disappeared, so too should the Jews. Many people, I think, are familiar with the famous aphorism of August Bebel, one of the leaders of German socialism in the 1800s, that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Although that phrase is often taken to be simply a critique of those socialists who blamed Jewish capitalists for the plight of the working class, Bebel's comment also suggests, I would suggest, that wise men understand that Jews are merely symptoms of a disease, the religion of money and capitalism, which must be destroyed. To attack the Jews alone, Bebel was suggesting, is as futile as treating the symptoms of a disease while ignoring its causes. Now, obviously there have been Marxist thinkers and writers who have defended Jews and befriended Jews. There have been Marxist parties that have been friendly at various times to Jewish interests and which have fought anti-Semitism. But a very significant segment of the Marxist tradition that can be traced directly back to Marx has a very cold spot in its heart for Jews. I want to focus in my talk tonight on one particular segment of that Marxist tradition, Marxism-Leninism. Marxist-Leninist regimes, of course, have a very sorry history of hostility to Jewish interests and Jewish values. I do not have to detail to this audience the long and brutal account of Soviet anti-Semitism. Throughout Eastern Europe, communist regimes have periodically engaged in anti-Semitic campaigns and purges and restricted, more or less at different times, the ability of Jews to survive as Jews. The most significant group of communist dissidents, the Trotskyists, have fiercely denounced Jewish religion and Zionism. During World War II, urged Jews to trust in the power of the European working class to save them from Nazism, and refused to support the Allies on the grounds that World War II was an imperialist war. This sorry record calls to mind another story. Supposedly, shortly after the Russian Revolution had taken place, a group of yeshiva students in a small Russian town excitedly came running up to their rabbi and informed him that one of the two most powerful men in the new Soviet government, Leon Trotsky, was Jewish. His name, they told the rabbi, had originally been Bronstein. The rabbi was not as enthusiastic, and the students asked him, why not? And supposedly he responded, the Trotskys make the revolution, but the Bronsteins pay for it. To help understand why, despite this dreary record, so many Jews were attracted to Marxist movements, I want to focus for a little bit on the American Communist Party. Despite its rhetorical denunciations of anti-Semitism and its boasts about its commitment to true Jewish causes, the history of the American Communist Party includes a clear display of activities and pronouncements hostile to Jews. Most notable is its lifelong fidelity to the Soviet Union. During the years in which Jewish culture was being suppressed and Jewish writers and intellectuals were being killed, American communists savagely denounced anyone who dared to suggest that something was amiss. When the teaching of Hebrew was prohibited, American communists responded that no Soviet Jews wanted to learn that dead language. When the regime published anti-Semitic books, American communists defended the regime. When Czechoslovakia executed nearly a dozen top communists, all Jews, in 1952 as agents of Zionist imperialism, American communists defended the executions. When Stalin denounced rootless cosmopolitans, they discerned no evidence of anti-Semitism. They hailed the 1929 Arab riots in Palestine, during which Jewish rabbinical students in Hebron were slaughtered, as evidence of a national liberation movement, and they supported Arab governments in 1967 and 1973. They cheered the Nazi-Soviet pact, and they applauded the Soviet-inspired UN resolution labeling Zionism as racism. Now, Jews have played a major role in a variety of American radical groups, ranging from the Socialist Labor Party, that was led by Daniel de Leon, a Sephardic Jew, through the anarchists, whose most prominent representatives in America were Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, both Jews, to the Socialist Party of Meyer London, Victor Berger, and Morris Hillquit. Nevertheless, probably no other radical group has been so heavily Jewish in the United States as the Communist Party, despite the record I've just recited. First of all, as we try to understand why this affiliation took place, despite this record, it's obvious that most Jews were not communists. At its height, in 1939, the American Communist Party had about 100,000 members, and approximately 40,000 were of Jewish origin. Since there were several million Jews in the United States, the proportion of American Jews who were communists is clearly quite small. Nevertheless, Jews were substantially overrepresented in the party over the years. During the 1920s, they were not the largest ethnic group. American Finns, of all groups, had that dubious distinction. But by the 1930s, over a third of the Communist Party was Jewish. One study that I conducted indicated that in the period from 1920 to 1961, 1/3 of all the members of the Central Committee of the American Communist Party were Jewish. The center of communist strength in the United States, New York, was also home to the largest Jewish community in the country. Now, the party was somewhat sensitive about its Jewish image. Individual Jewish party functionaries frequently changed their names to present a more American face. Thus, Israel Regenstrief became John Gates. Gil Greenberg became Gil Green. Jacob Liebstein became J. Lovestone. Non-Jewish ethnic communists also changed their names. Arvo Holberg became Gus Hall, the present party leader. He's Finnish. But I found the practice far more common among Jews. Moreover, it took Jews considerably longer to work their way up the Communist Party ladder than it did non-Jews. There was a preferential system of promotion to develop non-Jewish leadership. Other evidence of the Jewish presence in the party is abundant. The first communist daily newspaper in the United States was not the Daily Worker, but the Freiheit, published in Yiddish. The Jewish People's Fraternal Organization, created to compete with the Workmen's Circle, reached a membership of 60,000 in 1947 and was by far the largest ethnic bloc in the communists' fraternal group, the International Workers' Order. The only union led by an avowed communist was the largely Jewish Fur and Leather Workers Union, whose fiery president was Ben Gold. Some of the other unions where communist influence was considerable, ranging from the distributive workers and the United Public Workers to the Teachers Union, were largely Jewish and concentrated in New York. The radical student movement of the 1930s was strongest on campuses with large numbers of Jewish students, and a large percentage of its leaders were Jewish. In a mock presidential election in 1936, communist candidate Earl Browder got 25% of the vote at City College. Under party sponsorship, the United Workers Cooperative Colony, or the COOPS, a housing project in the Bronx, provided the nearest thing in America to the Soviet Union. Almost entirely Jewish, its members observed May Day, ignored Yom Kippur, and even the athletic teams sported party slogans and the names of party heroes. The Soviet Union's role as an opponent of Nazism was a major factor in these events. Of the 3,000 Americans who went to Spain to fight in the communist-recruited Abraham Lincoln Brigade against the Nazi-backed forces of General Franco, for example, some 40% were Jewish. Even, incredibly enough, even the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939 did not drive most communist Jews out of the party. It did lead to the loss of about 1/3 of the party membership, and although it's impossible to get figures, probably most of them were Jewish. But most Jews did not quit the party then. During the 1940s, communist support for the formation of the State of Israel enhanced the party's position in the Jewish community. The American Labor Party of New York, closely allied with the Communist Party, did best in heavily Jewish election districts. One of its candidates, Leo Isaacson, was elected to Congress from the Bronx in 1948. That same year, Jews gave Progressive Party candidate Henry Wallace, also backed by the communists, 10 to 15% of their votes, while he got 2% from non-Jews. It's estimated that 1/3 of Wallace's 1.1 million votes probably came from Jewish voters. It was not until 1957 and revelations about Soviet anti-Semitism published in the socialist world, combined with official Soviet admission of Stalin's crimes and the Soviet invasion of Hungary, that most Jewish communists quit the party. A small core, however, still remained, clustered around the Freiheit, edited by Paul Novick, one of the Freiheit's original editors when it was set up in 1922. In 1973, Novick was expelled from the Communist Party, accused of being some kind of closet Zionist because of his support for Israel in the 1973 war. Along with a handful of other longtime communists, such as Morris Shappies, editor of Jewish Currents, Novick published an open letter to Soviet authorities protesting against Soviet anti-Semitism. In response, the Communist Party called upon loyal communist readers of the Freiheit to oust Novick as editor. By this time, the Freiheit had about 6,000 subscribers, and this time they refused to bow to party pressure. The Freiheit became a non-communist newspaper. Now, the Freiheit finally did fold last year in response to a disappearing audience, and Novick himself died earlier this year at the age of 97. A handful of Jews remain in the Communist Party today, still loyal to whatever the current Soviet line is. The American Communist Party is having, at the moment, a very difficult time trying to figure out what the current Soviet line is. They still make much of the existence of Birobidzhan, the Soviet homeland for Jews in Siberia, where a few thousand Jews still remain. The most prominent apologist, Herbert Abthecker, constantly compares Israel to Nazi Germany and fulminates against Jewish neoconservatives as, quote, vermin, end quote. How can we explain the disproportionate number of Jews who have given their allegiance to Marxist doctrines and to radical parties like the American Communist Party? There are a number of explanations, and I don't think any of them are entirely satisfactory. Marx himself would have argued that economic circumstances, and in particular, one's position in the class struggle, was crucial. Like so many other Marxist predictions, this one is wrong. In the early part of this century, the argument that economic exploitation leads people to become radicals might have seemed plausible. When the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population in this country lived in squalid slums and labored in sweatshops. Jews, however, were the only ethnic group to contribute large numbers of middle-class members to the American Communist Party. And if economic distress led directly to political radicalization, other American groups would have had and would have far more of a role in Marxist movements than they do. While economic misery no doubt had a role in the early attraction of radicalism for Jews, it's clearly inadequate as a prime answer. As numerous commentators have pointed out, it is impossible to predict American Jewish political views from economic indicators. In the words of one pundit, Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. In line with that quip, some scholars have suggested that Judaism accounts for the attraction of radicalism for Jews. The central episode in Jewish life, the Exodus, has been read for centuries as a rationale for ending oppression and slavery. Jewish law includes a commitment to social justice, enjoining people to help the needy and aid the downtrodden. Unlike Christianity, which stresses human sinfulness and preparation for life after death, Judaism encourages social activism and tikkun olam, repair of life on this earth. Marxism, some have suggested, is a secularized form of Judaism. While removing God, it provided a new prime mover, the historical process. While rejecting the idea that the Jews were a chosen people, Marx promulgated a new code in which the proletariat was chosen to lead the world to redemption and to build the kingdom of God, a chosen class instead of a chosen people. Just as the Jews had no country of their own, neither did Marx's proletariat. In place of the messianic vision of the Bible, Marx suggested socialism as the fulfillment of the kingdom of God. By this argument, Marx had written an atheist's Torah, one that appealed to Jews precisely because it spoke to some of their most fundamental values while stripping away the religious overlay. While there's some virtues in this explanation and some very, very suggestive parallels, I think it also has some problems. Most Jews around the world have not been radicals, not even most non-religious Jews. This account does not explain why. It unfairly suggests that Jews who were not radicals were somehow not true to the ethical and moral values of Judaism. It takes at face value the Marxist claim that it seeks only the creation of a just society. Moreover, many Jewish Marxists knew absolutely nothing of Judaism, and others rejected it totally. A third explanation focuses on anti-Semitism. Another Jewish apostate, the conservative Englishman Benjamin Disraeli, chastised European governments more than a century ago for their anti-Semitic policies. Because of their heritage, he suggested, Jews faced economic, educational, social, and political limits on their opportunities. And this discriminatory treatment, Disraeli suggested, led to a sense of injustice and a commitment to changing society to prevent it from continuing. I think it's clearly true that many Jews were attracted to communism and socialism, to Marxism, on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the enemies of the Jews in Europe were the same enemies as the Marxists' enemies: the church, repressive regimes. Few Jews, obviously, shed any tears at the destruction of Tsarism in Russia. For many Jewish communists, the myth of the Soviet Union as a country that had abolished anti-Semitism was a very powerful magnet. The terrible pogroms that were linked with the old regime and its defenders during the Russian Civil War contributed to an aura of goodwill, or at worst, neutrality towards the Bolsheviks. And secular Jewish culture was allowed to flourish briefly in the 1920s. Many Jewish communists in the United States were originally from Russia or had family there. By the same token, communists were also a target of Nazism, which frequently fulminated against Judeo-Bolshevism. Again, this explanation of anti-Semitism as the factor driving Jews to Marxism has some validity, but it does not explain why anti-Semitism led many more Jews to opt for Zionism or assimilation. Moreover, it ignores the fact that many Jews became communists only after coming to the United States, which presumably had far less anti-Semitism than Russia. Finally, intense anti-Semitism in a number of radical movements did not prevent these Jews from joining such movements. Russian radicals defended pogroms on the grounds that attacks on Jewish capitalists were a sign of increasing class consciousness by the peasantry. In the early years of Bolshevik rule, there was fierce repression of aspects of Jewish political activity. Jewish Marxists over the years apologized for or ignored crude anti-Semitism emanating from the Eastern Bloc. Still another explanation focuses on Jewish self-hatred. It's easy enough to see that this phenomenon exists in the case of Marx, I think. But I don't think it's a very successful explanation beyond a limited number of people. Not all, not even most Jewish communists hated their families or their people. Many believed very deeply that only communism could save the Jewish people, and they were willing to ignore clear evidence of anti-Semitism in those movements in order to try to live up to that vision. I would like to suggest very briefly still another possibility, recognizing that it shares some of the same weaknesses that I've just given for other explanations. And that is that Marxism was attractive to so many Jews because it offered an escape from political and social marginalization. Marx presented a vision of a universal society with all bonds of religion, ethnicity, and race erased. In the socialist utopia of the future, Marx argued, individuals were to be judged entirely on rational, universal criteria. Heritage would no longer matter. Only individual achievement and individual destiny. While Zionism suggested that Jews would separate themselves from Christian society and create their own world, while assimilation suggested taking on the coloration of the existing society, Marxism offered the promise of inclusion in the society to all outsiders. It promised a world in which everyone was a member of the same class, a world in which there were no more outsiders. And of course, Jews have been the quintessential outsiders in Western Christian society. Even the United States, which had no system of institutionalized anti-Semitism, had enough social anti-Semitism that many Jews felt that they were not and could not become full members of the society. For another example, I think it's somewhat suggestive that among Palestinian Arabs, those factions that are the Marxist ones contain a disproportionate number of Christian Arabs, who I suspect have a sense that in a Palestinian society, as Christians, they would be outsiders, and that Marxism offers them a kind of universal doctrine which promises them a place in that society. Just over 100 years after Karl Marx died, the political movements inspired by his ideas are in disarray and retreat around the world. On the one side, democratic socialist parties, few of which, very few of which, still call themselves Marxist, are groping to combat the political advances of conservatives. Economic planning is in eclipse in favor of relatively untrammeled free markets, and electoral strategies built around appeals to the working class no longer generate enthusiasm in societies that increasingly think of themselves as middle class. On the other side, more drastically, the communist world is in the midst of a far-reaching and, one hopes, terminal crisis. From Moscow to Beijing to East Germany, communist regimes are struggling to cope with an unprecedented collapse of their economic systems, frantically seeking a solution to daunting political crisis, and abandoning long-cherished myths derived from Marx. Marxism has been one of the most powerful political and ideological forces in this century. It has attracted adherents in every country on earth and inspired a prodigious amount of discussion, debate, and exegesis. Many of the best minds of the world have been enthralled by its complexities, and millions of ordinary people have been enraptured by its simplicities. Bloodthirsty tyrants have murdered millions in its name, and zealous and idealistic revolutionaries have excused their crimes by repeating its words. Millions more have been murdered because they were or were believed to be Marxists by people convinced that Marxism had to be fought and exterminated. From its origins, Marxism has been at war with Jews, equating them with a social system that had to be eliminated. Jews embittered by and alienated from those social systems have turned to Marxism as one possible answer. As Western societies have become more pluralistic and open and liberal, Jewish support of Marxism has waned. The Jewish encounter with Marxism has been a tragedy for Jews, a tragedy whose last act is now hopefully being written. Thank you very much.
Do you use personal psychology in your history? I say that because aside from the one reference to Marx's possible self-hatred, as I think about communists I've known, And they're getting harder and harder to find, although we were talking about that, except perhaps on college campuses in sophomore year or something of that sort. I don't know. But the communists that I've known were always possessed by a great sense of the coherence and the integration and the rationality and the just great sense of vision that the movement gave to them. And in our analysis here tonight, we're hearing what's wrong with it and so forth. Well, where did that love come from?
Well, I think that in many respects it can be an attractive doctrine. It is coherent. It provides a comprehensive worldview that gives answers on every possible issue and question. And quite often they're not simple answers. That is, it's a very complex and can be I think for many people, intellectually stimulating doctrine. I think that at certain times and in certain kinds of societies, it can present a view of the world that's plausible. Mm-hmm. That is, I think that in the late 1800s, around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, the kind of vision of capitalism that Marx had and his argument about the development of working class movements had some plausibility. Mm-hmm. And an additional factor is that there's a very strong element in Marxism, a sense of well, Marx said his doctrine was scientific socialism, and that it was true, that history was moving in a certain way. The early Bolsheviks were very conscious of this, always warning people that wavered that the train of history was leaving the station, and if you didn't get on, you would be left behind. Mm-hmm. And so there's a very powerful element in Marxism of solidarity, of being in tune with the historical process.
To what extent do you think the social upheavals, the almost seismic changes that were taking place sociologically in and among European Jewish communities at this time? I mean, it did follow on the heels of Enlightenment and emancipation and revolutions and counter-revolutions. And insofar as Jews were literally uprooted from their soil, was this also a new way of locating themselves in a universe that seemed to be spinning out of control?
I think it was, and I think that a large portion of the explanation of the Jewish attraction to Marxism is linked to the fact that Jews in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, were proletarianized, urbanized at a particular point in European history. And not only that, but where they were living also had a major impact. But I think that we were talking about this earlier. I don't buy the argument that there's something in Judaism that made Jews turn to Marxism, that it's a kind of Marxism is a secularized form of Judaism. But I think it's also clear that there were elements in the Jewish tradition that combined with this particular historical moment in Eastern Europe, and to a lesser extent in Western Europe and the United States, that drew Jews towards Marxism.
Yeah. There's something that perhaps many people are unaware of, is that Talmudic Judaism has a concept of economics, which is, of course, highly idealized and never really existed in any known Jewish society throughout history, but it was the rabbi's vision of what an ideal social and economic system would be like. And it's a system in which there's no surplus value. That is to say, everything is almost literally a fair exchange, in which ideally one person never comes out lower than another at the end of any kind of an economic transaction. Now, how many Jews realize that that was implicit in the Talmud's economic system, I can't tell you, but it's there. A question about let's say back to the 1930s, when there were these enormous percentages of Jews in the Communist Party. Did you have to do much to be a communist in those days? I mean, could you be a parlor communist, sort of like Leonard Bernstein being a parlor Black Panther, or did you really have to be involved in the movement up to your eyebrows?
No, I mean, there were different levels of participation, just as there are in any kind of political movement. Even for most people, though, even to nominally be a communist meant something rather different than being nominally a Democrat or a Republican, although there weren't very many of those in the Jewish community. For one thing, most people being a communist meant attending an awful lot of meetings, and communist
sounds like synagogue life.
Maybe that's another parallel. Communist literature is replete. The internal party bulletins are replete. The party people recognize that they put incredible demands on people, and that was a factor that drove a lot of people out of the Communist Party. I mean, one of the things that you could say about most communists was that they became ex-communists. There was tremendous turnover in the party. 20, 30, 40% of the people that joined in one year would leave within a year. And the party itself recognized that this came because most people couldn't stand the kinds of demands that were made on them, so that after an initial burst of enthusiasm, they would gradually withdraw from activities. There was a clear difference between the rank and file party members and the party functionaries, who were much more committed, much more active, and far more dedicated.
Mm-hmm. Is that to say then that being a communist in the United States was not sort of molded on the Bolshevik principle? In other words, there was a broad-based communism which lots of people could link up with, but the leadership cadre was really quite separate?
Well, the ideal always was the Bolshevik model, but the party realized that quite often was impossible to attain. And it also varied depending on the policies that the Communist Party was following. For the last half of the 1930s, when the communist policy was what was known as the Popular Front, a broad coalition against fascism, the party, there's one famous line in a party bulletin that had a letter from a communist at a college campus who was explaining what the Young Communist League was going to be up to that semester, and he listed all the important work they were going to be doing, fighting fascism and encouraging support for the Soviet Union. And he said, now some people think that communists don't have any fun. That's not true. He said, we were also concerned about things like how the football team is going to do this year and getting students out with school spirit to cheer them on. So in the 1920s, that kind of remark would have probably led to his expulsion from the party as an unserious person. But in the 1930s, it was tolerated.
To take it on the opposite extreme, the opposite from having fun, when I was growing up, there was a television program, I think it was with Richard Carlson, I Led Three Lives, about Herbert Philbrick, who was an ordinary businessman and a member of the Communist Party and an FBI counter-spy. And did you have to do anything bad if you were in the Communist Party? I mean, could you become a criminal as a result of this?
Well, a very small number of people that were in the party spied for the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Most communists obviously did not, but a few did. And I'm working on a book now about something called the Amerasia case, which was really the first of the post-World War II spy cases in the United States. And it involved a group of people that put out a magazine called Amerasia, who were arrested for conspiracy to commit espionage in 1945. And the editor of the magazine was a man named Philip Jaffe, who was a fellow traveler of the Communist Party. Under the Freedom of Information Act, I obtained all the FBI files on this case, and the FBI had wiretapped Jaffe, so that the long transcripts of his conversations. And in one of them, in which he's trying to recruit somebody to spy, Jaffe explains that he gets very angry at I.F. Stone, who at the time was very pro-communist. But Jaffe explained that Stone had written a column in which he had some criticism of Joseph Stalin. And Jaffe launched into this diatribe, and he said, I simply won't tolerate that. He said, the Soviet Union is the one bright, shining star of mankind. And anything that contributes to the Soviet Union's survival and health is something that we have to do. Now, I'm not suggesting, again, that there were very many American communists that spied for the Soviet Union, but that kind of mindset led some people to do so.
When we were examining the phenomenon in Europe, I told Professor Klehr this earlier. We have about 30 young former Soviet residents who are now here in the United States as part of the Passage for Freedom program, and they're making their adjustment to the United States, living here at the 92nd Street Y. And I had told some of them about this program and invited them to come on up and practice listening in English and expanding their vocabulary, especially because I thought this would be a topic that they might have some special interest in. And I explained that it would be exploring the Jewish connection to communism and to Marxism, and what special attraction the movement might have held for Jews. Whereupon one of them very calmly explained to me that it really was quite understandable, given the history of the Tsarist regime and its mistreatment of the Jews, that when communism became available, Jews rallied to it as a sort of national liberation movement. And I said, I'm sure that that's true in part, but we're going to be looking a great deal at the American Jewish involvement with communism and how after they came here, they joined the party. And he looked at me incredulously and he said, that's crazy. Why would anyone do a thing like that? And I guess that's what I'm still after, you know. Was that a way of acclimating yourself to America, or?
In some cases, I think it was. I think that American Jews who joined the Communist Party had different motives, and that may be why any one single explanation doesn't capture the entire reason. For example, there were Jews in the party who really had no desire to go much out beyond the Jewish world, the Jewish communist world, and they really existed within that world. On the other hand, for some young Jews growing up in the beginning of the Depression, the American Communist Party, oddly enough, was a route to Americanization. They changed their names. They left New York and became party organizers in Middle America, in exotic locales, Toledo, Ohio, and Youngstown, and places like that. The Communist Party was, for many of them, a place where they met non-Jews, where they met young people from other ethnic backgrounds. And so for some, it was as I suggested toward the end of my talk, in some cases it was a response to this political and social marginalization. The Communist Party, with its universal ideological vision, was a route in some peculiar way to Americanization for them.
I'd like to invite our audience to participate. I don't mean to monopolize this. Yes, a hand up on the aisle back there.
I don't want to get involved in the search for the historical Marx any more than I'd like to get involved in the search for the historical Jesus. But it seems to me that saying that Marx was a rabid anti-Semite is sort of like saying that Altgeld, Darrow, and Sandberg were rabid anti-Semites. I think, perhaps there's a lack of concern there rather than a feeling of bigotry, self-hatred, or hatred of others. And I would accept your statement that, perhaps there has been a lot of anti-Semitism on the left, but it seems to me that, you're complaining about coercion against Jews joining the left at the same time that you're complaining about anti-Semitism on the left. And I would submit that at various periods in the history of both this country and Europe, there's been much less coercion with regard to joining the Socialist Party or even the Communist Party. And I would submit that within the last 20 years we've had such a period, and perhaps that's why Mitch Decker and Norman Podhoretz have stopped talking the way you do.
Is there a question?
No, it's a statement.
Oh, okay. Professor Cuddy.
A couple of short questions. One, it's the Popular Front period. In your studies, is there any kind of ethnic-specific involvement of American Jewish communists in that? Because the Popular Front seemed to enable them to put two hats on, where 100% Americans and 100% communists. So there's one question. Secondly, Karl Bernstein's book on his parents. The only review of that satisfied me with Horowitz's commentary. Have you any sort of comment on that, on what he left out?
Let me summarize
Why would he leave it out?
Let me summarize the question in case the back of the audience couldn't hear. The first question had to do, was there any ethnic Jewish involvement with the Popular Front movement specifically? Disproportional involvement in the Popular Front movement, since that was a movement that gave a person the opportunity to say, I am tried and true American, and yet at the same time support this more radical leading edge kind of thought. And then the second one was, had Professor Klehr read Karl Bernstein's book dealing with his life growing up as a red diaper baby in the 40s and 50s, and was there anything that was left out that Bernstein should have had the courage to address?
The first question, the Popular Front enabled the party to appeal more directly to the Jewish community, and that certainly was something that a lot of Jewish communists felt some relief at. One of the primary episodes in the American Communist Party's relationship to the Jewish community took place in 1929, when the Arab riots in Palestine took place. The first reaction of the Freiheit had been shock and horror, and it in fact had a headline or a story in which it called the events a pogrom. The editors were then called to Communist Party headquarters and told that it was not a pogrom, this was a national liberation struggle. And they duly switched the line, and the Jewish communists had a very difficult time in the Jewish community as a result of that episode. A number of newsstands refused to carry the Freiheit, so on. By 1935, when the Popular Front was inaugurated, American communists shortly thereafter started to rethink how they could reach ethnic groups in the United States. And one of the conclusions they came to was that their previous policy had turned these groups off. And so that prior to 1935, they had denounced Zionism, for example, feverishly. Now, while they were still opposed to Zionism, they were no longer quite so rabid about it and were willing to cooperate on certain issues with Zionists. Earl Browder's wife, who was a Jewish woman from the Soviet Union, he had met her on one of his trips to Russia and married her there. She wrote an article for the Communist Party's magazine in which she called for American communists now to be not only good communists, but good Jews, good Irishmen, good Italians, good Negroes, and so forth. That is, that being a communist meant you did not have to surrender your ethnic heritage. The party around that time, by the way, also stopped another practice that they had engaged in. They used to, particularly the Young Communist League, used to make it a point on Yom Kippur to go outside of synagogues and eat pork as a sort of a demonstration of contempt for tradition. That stopped. So in that sense, the Popular Front allowed the party to appeal to American Jews. Were Jews disproportionately represented among the major figures of the Popular Front? I don't think so. It was most closely identified with Earl Browder, who was not Jewish. Several other of the leading figures of the party were not Jewish. In fact, after 1929, when Stalin removed J. Lovestone as the head of the American Communist Party, no Jew ever again held that position. In a number of other high-ranking party positions, Jews were clearly excluded. For example, there was a fellow named Karl Ross who, for a number of years in the 1930s, headed the Young Communist League. His original name was Karl Rossi. He also was Finnish, from Minnesota. And he left the Communist Party in the late 1950s. And I interviewed him a number of years ago, and I asked him why he had become how he'd become head of the Young Communist League. He was a very obscure figure from Minnesota when he was suddenly made head of the YCL. And he said, "I wasn't Jewish." They wanted somebody who was not Jewish. The second point, Carl Bernstein's book, I think it's an interesting book. I wish he had been as thorough an investigative reporter in that book as he had been on Watergate. I didn't particularly like his father's, I didn't like his father's politics at all, then or now, but I felt a sort of real sympathy for his parents who didn't want him to write the book, and he went ahead and wrote it anyway. I think there's sort of limits on journalism, and he went past them.
Yes, this gentleman.
What I was really after trying to understand what made Marx search for a solution. Did something happen in his life? I mean, from what you said, that he was baptized, his father was imprisoned, and he was baptized. So I don't see there, in this very limited mention that they have about his life, any reason why he would look for different solution for such a wide, inclusive solution. So I guess it's something must definitely must make a certain trauma or something.
Well,
Could everyone hear the question? Was there anything possibly that happened in Marx's life that might have elicited this monumental reaction in him, since after all his father had converted to Christianity, he was raised in a Christian home, presumably now they had entered the middle class and they were bourgeois, comfortable, etc., and yet we get this great response. Is there anything that can be added on that?
I tend to be suspicious of sort of psychological explanations for intellectual theories. I think that Marx believed that he had discovered the riddle to history. He believed he had done for history, human history, what Darwin had done for the development of mankind. And I just think that he, intellectually came to the conclusion that he had scientifically solved the problem of social development.
Yes, on the left aisle over here. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, in addition to the explanations that you gave about the attraction of the Jews, whether there's two others that I think might possibly have some relevance. One is the difference in status among Jews, that their economic and social status is different. That they might have had high economic status, but relatively low. And that difference contributed to it. Looking for something that would give them the social status that they thought they deserved and wanted. And number two would be, closely related to what you said about the marginality, the fact that intellectuals, Jews as intellectuals, I think have this need for many of these things that you mentioned. Rationality and belonging.
I think that the first point is well taken, and I think that relates to the whole issue of marginality. That is that we think that certain kinds of success in society should also mean other kinds of success, and when it doesn't, for whatever reason, one feels that one is not getting one's due. The second point, I think there's something to that, but of course most of the Jews that were attracted to Marxism were not intellectuals, they were ordinary people. I'm not sure, there's no way to tell this, I'm just not sure how many people, how many American Jews that became Marxists, how many people that became Marxists ever read much more of Marx than the Communist Manifesto. There are different levels at which Marxism appeals. There's obviously an intellectual level. There are other kinds of, there are emotional levels as well.
Just as a point of information question, in the post-war period, post-First World War period, there were a lot of people around, both utopian as well as practical, who felt that the world was in need of reform after the cataclysm of the First World War. And insofar as socially transforming movements, basically, it seems to me, were confined to Marxism and fascism, was there anywhere else that a Jew who wanted to see the world changed once and for all could locate himself or herself?
Well, interestingly enough, in the case of the United States, in the 1920s, large numbers of Jews were not attracted to Marxism. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think there were others. There were a whole variety of groups on the left, of course, and some of which were not Marxist. Mm-hmm. The anarchists, for example, various brands of utopian socialism, syndicalism. It is an interesting question. For example, syndicalism, which is sort of the ideology of groups like the IWW, the Wobblies. As far as I know, syndicalism never had much appeal for Jews, unlike Marxism. Various kinds of progressive politics, that's more mainstream politics. And of course, but one thing we have to remember is that most Jews were not attracted to Marxism. Right. And most Jews obviously were not. Right. Most of them in the United States were Democrats.
Okay. All the way back, and then I'll come around to this lady. Mm-hmm.
I had the impression listening to your talk that the extent to which Jews figured prominently in the communist world is, in a sense, some form of just pathology. Some either psychological pathology or some kind of intellectual pathology that, especially because of the current disarray of the communist movement, retroactively one can say that any involvement by this unusual number of Jews is simply a matter of pathology. Could you speak to what contributions that are appreciated in by the public at large or people at large that Jewish communists made, even if they later left? Wasn't there anything positive in what they did?
I didn't mean to suggest, retroactively that it's a pathology. I think it's curious. Yes, I think that there were positive things that American communists did. There were things that American communists supported that were entirely worthwhile. There were positions they held that I certainly don't find objectionable, in some cases even find admirable. However, I think you take a political movement as a whole, so that if you look at the one element that the Communist Party itself holds up as its sort of shining principle, anti-fascism, resistance to fascism. Fighting Franco in Spain, fighting the Nazis in the Spanish Civil War. It was an utterly admirable kind of act, and a rather selfless act on the part of large numbers of people who lost their lives. Of the 3,000 or 4,000 Americans that went to Spain, half of them never came back. They died there. I think there's a difference between sort of individual actions and how you evaluate a political movement. And when you look at the American Communist Party and anti-fascism, there are things besides the Spanish Civil War, for example. There's a rather sorry history of collaboration with the Nazis to help bring down the Weimar government in Germany. And in the United States, it was far less malign, simply because the American communists spent their time denouncing Norman Thomas as a sort of the fascist danger in the United States. It was more a joke. In Germany, obviously, when the communists launched attacks on the socialists as the main enemy of the working class and didn't worry much about the fascists, it had a much more severe consequence. There's the Nazi-Soviet pact. So, I don't think that you can say somebody who joined a Jew that joined the Communist Party in the 1930s to help fight fascism was being pathological. I wonder about a Jew, however, who joined the Communist Party to fight against fascism and gave full support to the Nazi-Soviet pact, or who stayed in the Communist Party to cheer Stalin's denunciations of rootless cosmopolitans, or to applaud or to be silent when the Soviet Union killed Jewish writers, and the American Communist Party applauded that.
Just if I could follow up, I'm curious, the very question that your talk is based on, which is the phenomenon of a large number of Jews proportional to the other members of the group. Not, and you keep pointing out that by no means that all Jews have an affinity for it. To what extent could you compare that preponderance to other preponderances? For example, the large number of Jews involved in the arts, the performing arts, let's say, in the United States. Could you compare other kinds of predominances, which might mean other kinds of fast entries into a realm due to some curious concatenation of factors?
You hit on a point that we started to discuss at dinner, and I said that I thought maybe next year I was going to do something on the Jewish phenomenon in violin playing, and was it anything like that? Is this what you're asking?
It's a very good question, and I don't pretend to know the answer. It's a fascinating phenomenon, and you find in certain sectors of cultural life and in certain kinds of political movements large numbers of Jews. You can, I think, in each particular case, perhaps develop a sociological argument about why that should take place. Whether there's some kind of overarching principle there, I don't know. If you can develop it, you'll have a real good article or book.
Yes, the lady in the center, yes.
Yes, in response to this fellow in front of me, I was thinking, especially at the beginning of your lecture, when you spoke about Marx's rapid anti-Semitic feeling, and said that his father, or the line of rabbis, his father had converted, and he was baptized early on in his life. And the question that I kept asking myself is, who is a Jew? Why do we identify this man? I mean, for the purposes of this series, these are three Jews who had visions of redemption. Why do we continue to identify this man as a Jew?
That's a real good question. I suppose for the same reason that in some senses we continue to identify Jesus as a Jew in some ways. At least he was born a Jew.
And you might say that there's a certain ethno-psychology involved. One of the purposes, perhaps, of the family would be to eventually lose that label, but at least at this particular point. Not sure that they had shed their skin.
One thing that occurs to me, and it goes back to the question that was raised earlier, that I don't know how much bearing this has. When Marx first went off to college, to the university, his father wanted him to study law and have a profession. Marx wanted to study philosophy. And his father, some of his father's letters, his father remonstrates with him, what can you do with philosophy? You can't do anything. You need a career. You need a profession. And Marx's response was he was going to be a university teacher. Well, he could never be a university teacher, because even though he had converted in the eyes of the Prussian authorities, he was still a Jew. For purposes of appointment to the university, he was a Jew.
Almost makes me think of Nazi Germany, where Jews have been assimilated and have no identification as Jews. They say, yes, you are a Jew, you have a grandmother, and that's it. And I wonder whether our continuation or continuing to identify these people as Jews, and they themselves are blood.
Albert Vorspan has a marvelous game that he suggests that Jews play all the time. One game is called LTL. That's called Locate the Landsman. And that's whenever the Nobel Prizes are awarded, you quickly skim the list, you say, and you find out Dr. Varmus is, but Bishop isn't, that kind of. And then the other half of the game is DTL. That's Drop the Landsman. And that's when, you go to a Republican National Committee meeting and somebody says, Marx was Jewish. Well, no, he was converted at the age of 10, and that's so you're right. We have to watch that. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to make a statement. Over the years, I've been studying a few things in the later areas of genetics and history, Jewish history. And while it's very dangerous to talk about it, I think that you have to get out that there are genetic predispositions and idealism present. Genetic obsessive idealism present within the Jewish character, and it's passed down. There's a tendency to pass it down in the genes. 100%. There's a tendency, that's all. And I think that can explain a lot of the reasons why Jews have gone out into these causes and these specific areas of
That is one theory. Do you have a question for Dr. Klehr? Yes, sir.
Where in your schema you place Bolshevism, an ideology that I call Marxism with a Herrscher?
The gentleman's question has to do with the teachings of Ber Borchov, and which, as he calls it, is Marxism with a Heckscher. In other words, a particular Jewish Tom and to.
Well, I think that was clearly a sort of variant of Marxism, and I think it's also interesting that Borchov never, although it certainly was a factor in the labor Zionist movement, it was never the major factor or always a minority and among the Jews in Palestine. Some of, if I remember correctly, I think some of Borochov's followers, in fact, went back to the Soviet Union in the 1920s in an attempt to establish sort of little small Jewish farming communities in the Crimea, I believe, which I don't think lasted very long. But I think that clearly, there obviously were forms of Marxist Zionism.
Some people seem had Stalin there.
Oh, yeah, well, there's a segment of what used to be the old Mapam. Even in the early 1950s, after one of the leaders of Mapam was arrested in Czechoslovakia and put on trial. He was one of the 2 or 3 major leaders of the party. Mapam remained loyal to Stalinism.
One more question. Yes, sir.
In this age of plasma, there seems to be an increasing Marxism by some of the communist regimes in third world countries. Would you comment on this? Nicaragua, Cuba.
I missed there seems to be a what?
There seems to be an increasing adherence or defense of Marxism in a world in which communism obviously is undergoing tremendous change.
I think I wouldn't underestimate the Marxist commitment of the Sandinistas or some other third world revolutionaries. But I think in many cases it's combined with a kind of nationalism and nationalistic ideology. I think there's less Marxism in many of them and more Leninism. That is, that it's more an excuse for consolidating the reins of power. Quite often there's I mean, it's always amusing to me to hear the Ethiopians describe the regime as Marxist-Leninist. It's simply, it's a technique for maintaining power and a justification for destroying civil society, far more than it is related to kind of the intellectual vision that Marx held. But I think that even in a number of those countries, you see the crisis of Marxism in terms of simply the kinds of economic chaos that has ensued, so that places like Mozambique and Angola are retreating from Marxist principles. One of the few places that still sees Marxism advancing in the world is The Nation magazine, in published right here. I noticed, for example, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a front page editorial in The Nation about events in East Germany, and this was before Honecker resigned. And The Nation's editorial explained that the flight of 60 or 70,000 East Germans to West Germany should not be taken as a sign of the disillusionment with Marxism or attraction to capitalism. Because, The Nation explained, West Germany is really a Marxist society. And therefore, the flight, I'm not making this up, I actually have the editorial here, I could show it to you, because I was a little stunned by it too. But the flight from East Germany to West Germany, The Nation explained, is a flight from Stalin to Marx. So I suppose if West Germany is Marxist, then Marxism is not really in crisis after all. But that's a real big assumption to make.
I'd like to thank Dr. Harvey Klehr for being with us tonight and helping to shed some light on this fascinating problem. And I hope we'll see you next week when we have Professor Ben Halpern down from Brandeis to talk about another vision of redemption, and whether it was nearsighted or not, well, we'll explore that, the Zionist Herzlian view. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.